I'm back. I hope you didn't miss too much the series on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, but we're here for the third lecture, and you can see it's focused on the chapter on consciousness. So if you're following along with the book, this lecture will be on the section where Hegel focuses on consciousness and consciousness's different relationships to the world. So, as is typical in Hegelian philosophy, things are divided triadically. So the three different ways in which Hegel's going to try to understand consciousness and its relationship to the world is first through a phenomenal investigation of sensation, followed by a phenomenal investigation of perception, and finally an investigation of the understanding. And these three different levels of consciousness for Hegel are developing in a type of order which has a logical developmental pattern and a universal developmental pattern which is spontaneous for our consciousness. And then from this, he believes that the level beyond the understanding is the level where consciousness reaches self-consciousness. And when we reach the level of self-consciousness, we basically have a meta-level understanding, an understanding of understanding. And then we can move to a proper phenomenological view of consciousness, a consciousness which has come to a level of self recognition. And then when we have grasped these methodologies, we are then capable of utilizing the dialectical method as a tool to understand the motion of understanding in itself. So here you see a representation of the different relational levels between the conscious subject and the world object. And I'll just quickly go over them here. And you can see here sensation is defined very simply as our basic sensations, the five senses: sight, smell, sound, touch, and taste. And he defines these sensations as a type of qualitative richness and individual immediacy. So you just have basically perhaps the phenomena of what we'd expect an infant to have. You just have your senses and the immediate present, and you're just experiencing these senses in their absolute certainty. The next level would be perception, which gains a level of logical attention where you start to take this multiplicity of sensations and distinguish specific qualities. So, for example, instead of just being in the sense of hearing music or just being in the sense of tasting food, you would be able to, through your perception, distinguish types of sounds, or you'd be able to distinguish types of flavors and foods. Then on the third level with the understanding, you have the addition of synthetic reason, which adds fixed levels or fixed patterns of integrated interaction. And what that means is that you are now capable of generalizing perception to a level which is true not just for you, but for others as well. And so you reach a level of universal understanding of the notion. And we'll go deeper into this. So here to summarize for each Hegel's definition of sense, perception, and understanding. First, sense. Sense knowing, which is at the start or is immediately our object, cannot be anything else but immediate knowledge itself, a knowledge of the immediate or receptive. We must alter nothing in the object as it presents itself. In apprehending it, we must refrain from trying to comprehend it. So you can see here that what Hegel's trying to get at with sense certainty is that It's just the raw immediacy of experience. It's just what you would experience as an infant. If you shut down your understanding and your perception, of course, you can still go back to an experience which is just pure sense certainty, and it's just the most raw, low-level experiential level that we have access to. And it just accepts what is given, what is present, and nothing more is, there's no more logic, there's no more reason which is needed to confirm the truth of its object. Second, perception. Perception takes what is present to it as a universal, just as universality is its principle in general. The immediately self-differentiated moments within perception are universal. I is a universal and the object is a universal. It is logically necessitated. So with perception, you just have basically the formation of sort of a individuality, where the individual, the action of the I, starts to differentiate the sense certainty. It starts to pick an object and cut it off from the rest of the sense world, and identify properties with it, and in that experience of the perception, not yet on the level of the understanding, this is for the perception universal in itself. Moving to understanding. In understanding, unity of being for self and being for another is posited. The absolute antithesis is posited as a self-identical essence. To be for itself and to be in relation to another constitutes the nature and essence of the content, whose truth consists in its being unconditionally universal. So understanding for Hegel is a higher level than both sense certainty and perception, because not only do you have this unity of being for self and being of the object, which occurs in perception, but it's also true for all others. So it's very different to distinguish, say, an object just for the present moment of your perception, and then to go to the level of understanding where your distinguishing of an object is not only true for you, but true for all others too, and in all time. So you get to some higher level of the universal. And this is what Hegel means when he says the truth of the understanding is a being which is unconditionally universal. I mean, it's not just universal for you and your perception right now, but true for other perceptions and other humans in other times, in other places. So first, sensation. And throughout this lecture, I'm just going to represent the relationship between consciousness and the object as this circular unity which is spinning into itself, moving into itself to get a deeper understanding of itself. And Hegel's always very clear that this unity between the subject and the object are essentially what is being mediated throughout the entirety of the dialectical process. So again, sensation for Hegel is just this qualitative richness, this individual immediacy. So you can't quantify sensation. It's just a qualitative experience. And there's not really yet time. It's just present. Just the present experience, and just as simple as that, as simple as you could get. And all he's saying is that this simple present, as simple as you could get, is not subject or object, but both one. It's just this unity of subject and object. There's not yet even an emergence of a subject. And this is probably still true understanding from cognitive science and developmental psychology of infantile development, that there's not yet a self here. So the essence of this immediate experience is just the relation as a whole. Quote, "Sense certainty thus comes to know by experience that its essence is neither in the object nor in the I, and that its immediacy is neither an immediacy of the one nor of the other. For in both what I mean is rather something unessential, and the object and the I which I mean do not have a continuing being or are not. Thus we reach the stage where we have to posit the whole of sense certainty itself as its essence, and no longer only one of its moments, as happened in the two cases where first the object confronting the I and then the I were supposed to be its reality. This pure immediacy, therefore, its truth preserves itself as a relation that remains self-identical, and which makes no distinction of what is essential and what is unessential, between the I and the object, a relation, therefore, into which also no distinction whatever can penetrate. So what he's saying here is that sense certainty is before any distinction. There's not yet any separation. It's just sensation without any distinction. It's just a continuous qualitative unity of sight, of smell, of sound, of hearing. This is the starting point. And from this starting point, we start to develop more complexity. Furthermore on sensation, and now we get even into maybe a second level of sensation. What he's emphasizing here is basically the temporality of sensation, that in this qualitative richness, this individual immediacy, there are several nows. It's nothing but this plurality of nows. It's nothing but moment, 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 moment. And here on this just basic level, we can all sort of relate to in our experience of time, is this paradox that when you identify this present moment of sense, it's already past, it's already gone. But then you come back around and say, okay, well, if every time I say now it's already gone, then that's just what it is. That's the truth of it. The truth of it, if it's just this repetitive nows. So this is the emergence, basically, of the very sort of very basic, very elementary mechanics of the dialectics of the negation, that you have this now, it's not negation, and then the negation of the negation is you just come back to the present, it's nothing but that. So sensation is basically at its most elementary level, just this, the metaphysical level, it's just this constant movement, plurality of moments. And it's just that, that's all it is. And this is where Hegel would introduce his principle of negativity. There's no way to catch it, as it were. Quote. In this pointing out, then, we see merely a movement which takes the following course. I point out the now, and it is asserted to be the truth. I point it out, however, as something that has been, or as something that has been superseded. I set aside the first truth. I now assert as the second truth that it has been, that it is superseded. But what has been is not. I set aside the second truth, its having been, its suspension, and thereby negate the negation of the now, and thus return to the first assertion, that the now is. The now and pointing out the now are but a movement which contains various moments. Experience teaches me that the truth of sense certainty, in fact, is, I point it out as a here, which is a here of other heres, or is in its own self a simple togetherness of many heres. It is a universal. I take it up, then, as it is in truth, and instead of knowing something immediate, I take the truth of it, or perceive it. So this is just to repeat what I was trying to explain in the last slide, where the here and now is nothing but this plurality of motion. It's not a fixed, static thing. It's not that our sense certainty is just this immediate present of this one unified thing which doesn't move. It's nothing but this motion. It's nothing but this experience which is constantly changing. And that's what it is. That's what the now is. What we call the now is that, basically. And so to summarize sensation, it's again this our basic sensations of the world, our sight, our smell, sound, touch, and taste, and it's this qualitative level of immediate experience. But because although that is its positive dimension, what Hegel emphasized dialectically is that the conscious subject has to go beyond this because of an inherent negativity in this mode of interacting with the world, which is that precisely its constant changing of the here and now. So you can't pin down anything in it. It's just this primordial haze or this primordial fog of sense experience. And so we have to move beyond this. Quote, because of its concrete content, sense certainty immediately appears as this richest kind of knowledge, indeed a knowledge of infinite wealth for which no bounds can be found, either when we reach out into space and time in which it is dispersed, or when we take a bit of this wealth and by division enter into it. Moreover, sense certainty appears to be the truest knowledge, for it has not yet omitted anything from the object, but has the object before it in its perfect entirety. But in the event, this very certainty proves itself to be the most abstract and poorest truth. All that it says about what it knows is just that it is, and its truth contains nothing but the sheer being of the thing. So you can see here that Hegel starts off praising sense certainty before then criticizing its inherent dialectical flaw. And his praise of sense certainty is just that you just have this infinite sense which has no bounds or has no division or has no differentiation. It's not subject or object but both at the same time. And that the sense certainty, certainly of the infant, just takes this to be the true and takes this to be the truest possible. And you might even have some philosophies that still assert sense to be just the truest knowledge. But what Hegel's saying is that the fundamental flaw in sense certainty, and why self-consciousness or why we have to go beyond it, is basically that it's just too simple, and we can never get any determinate or active truth as a part of the thing. It's just a very low level of being, and we rise above it. So, and this brings us to perception. And what perception adds to sense certainty is logical attention. So he's now making this distinction between perceiving and the perceived, that there's some motion between the subject and the object which creates a difference, which creates a differentiation, which was before just a plurality of nows, this plurality of sense, now gains a distinction, a differentiation, which gives it a new character. There are certain properties which can be identified. So again, I gave the example of perhaps the difference between experiencing music before you are capable to add the logical attention which would be needed to say it's this type of music and it's this type of artist, and it's it's creating through the act of perceiving a perceived. It's making a cut into what was just, say, a haze of or a flow of sound. So you're distinguishing properties, what type of sound, what type of frequency, and so forth and so on. With the emergence of the principle, the two moments which in their appearing merely occur also come into being, one being the movement of pointing out, or the act of perceiving, the other being the same movement as a simple event or the object perceived. In essence, the object is the same as the movement. The movement is the unfolding and differentiation of the two moments, and the object is the apprehended togetherness of the moments. Yet since perceiving and perceived are related to each other as opposites, only one can be the essential moment in the relation, and the distinction of essential and unessential moment must be shared between them. One of them, the object, defined as the simple entity, is the essence regardless of whether it is perceived or not. But the act of perceiving, as a movement, is the unessential moment, the unstable factor which can as well be as not be. So you're seeing here a crucial difference between sense and perception for Hegel, which is this emergence of the two between the perceiver and the perceived. So the act of the perceiver and this emergence of a distinction with the perceived. And you also here see another crucial dialectical tool being deployed of the coincidence of the opposites with an asymmetrical coincidence of the opposites, where one has privilege over the other. So at this stage of the dialectical motion, the perceived has privilege over the perceiver. So basically, other than sense certainty, when I'm perceiving here not just that I see and I'm touching something, but I'm seeing and I'm touching and I'm feeling this book, and me and this book are one. But through the motion of the perceiver and the perceived, the motion of me as a perceiver brings out this perceived as a distinct object. But the perceived has primacy because I, as a perceiver, don't change this object as a perceived. This perceived is what it is in itself. I am merely creating the distinction or the differentiation between it and other things. So again, there's this crucial dimension of the asymmetrical unity. And this is crucial for all of Hegelian dialectics. The unity is never a symmetry, a perfect symmetry, otherwise there would be no time. In order for there to be time, there has to be symmetry, asymmetry, there has to be a difference between the two, internal to the two. So in this level, the difference is between the perceiving I and the perceived this, right? Me and the book, the I and the book. And this book is a distinction that I'm making, but it doesn't change the book in itself. So I'm just choosing, I have the choice to choose this book. There's a universal of many things. I could also choose these gloves. But it's my perception which takes this thing with many properties and makes it a perceived thing. So this is where we get in again to deploying the mechanics of the negation, where the negation first emerged with sensation, but now it's operating on the level of perception, where it's negating and preserving. So there is just this differentiated one, this thing which exists independently of me. But now through my mechanisms of perception, I am essentially creating a perceived through negation and preservation. So I'm identifying these gloves and not something else. Everything else is negated. The perceived shows itself to be the thing with many properties. The wealth of self-knowledge belongs to perception, for only perception contains negation, that is, difference or manifoldness, within its own essence. Perception and perceive cannot be together in the simple unity of their medium, an indifferent unity but a one as well, a unity which excludes another. The one is the moment of negation. It is itself quite simply a relation of self to self, and it excludes another. And it is that by which thinghood is determined as a thing. Negation is inherent in a property as a determinateness which is immediately one with the immediacy of being. An immediacy which, through this unity with negation, is universality. As a one, however, the determinateness is set free from this unity with its opposite, and exists in and for itself. So, he's basically saying that through this motion of perception, again, what was previously just this indifferent unity of a one, gains through the negation, gets an otherness, and a thing emerges. So a perceived emerges, the gloves, the book. And that in this process of perception, and the opposite, the book and the non-book. In order for me to say this is a book, there also has to be the non-book, what is not this. And then that's its opposite. And I can create a perceived thing through its opposite. And that this exists, me and the perceiver and the perceived, is in and for itself. So then we have the truth of perception, again, as you'll notice, in 3 different distinctions, which is, again, a triadic structure. So you'll have the indifferent passive universality, just the things out there. You'll have the perceiving one, which excludes opposite properties. So me as a perceiving one, I create this me in this book, and the opposite properties are excluded. And the unified expansion into host of differences. So I'll start to perceive many things: the book, the gloves, the cup, the lamp, the computer. This is all this process, these mechanics of the perceiver and the perceived, which takes this formerly indifferent passive universality, and now I'm expanding it through my perception into a host of differences. And so this is the relationship between the singular I, Cadell, and the plural thing, all the things in which I'm differentiating and making distinctions in. And this didn't exist at the level of sense certainty. It only comes into existence through the level of logical perception. I basically create a web of logical distinctions, which are basically in themselves, but being distinguished by me. In these moments, the thing has the truth of perception is completed. It is an indifferent passive universality, the also of the many properties, negation equally simple, or the one, which excludes opposite properties, and the many properties themselves, and therein expands into a host of differences, the point of singular individuality in the medium of subsistence, radiation forth into plurality. Insofar as these differences belong to the indifferent medium, they are themselves universal. They are related only to themselves and do not affect one another. But insofar as they belong to the negative unity, they are at the same time exclusive of other properties. But they necessarily have this relationship of opposition to the properties remote from there also. This then is how the thing of perception is constituted, and consciousness has only to take it, to confine itself to a pure apprehension of it, and what is thus yielded is the true. So what he's saying is that on the level of perception, what is true is just this manifold of differentiated things which gain an in and for themselves through this asymmetrical relationship between the perceiver and the perceived. And that when it's an indifferent manifold of things, they don't affect each other, but as soon as the emergence of the perceiver and the perceived come into motion, anything has an also, or a relationship to an otherness, where they're now interacting in relation to the others. So basically, when they're in an indifferent unity, they have no effect on each other, but when they're in relation to a negative unity, they start to come into contact through relations of opposition, right? Book and not book, glove and not glove, lamp and not lamp. Whereas before, there was just this indifference. They're just manifold of things not related to each other. So here, to summarize perception, you have this ability of self-consciousness to distinguish given properties and qualities. So, right, a book has, pages. It's bound. I can open it. I can turn pages. A glove has, fingers. It has a certain texture. It has a certain feel. Certain properties and qualities. But for Hegel, the problem with perception is that it it is again too simple because it can't integrate all of these qualities and all of these properties into a unity which transcends the particularity of perception itself. So in order for that, we have to go to yet a higher level. These empty abstractions and perception of a singleness and a universality opposed to it is always at its poorest when it fancies itself to be the richest, bandied about by these vacuous essences, thrown into the arms first of one and then of the other, and striving by its sophistry to hold fast and affirm alternatively first one of the essences and then the directly opposite one, it sets itself against the truth. This course is the steady everyday life and activity of perceptual consciousness, a consciousness which fancies itself to be moving in the realm of truth. It advances uninterruptedly to the outcome in which all these determinations are equally set aside. But in each single moment it is a conscious only of this one determinateness as the truth, and then in turn of the opposite one. What the nature of these untrue essences is really trying to get perception to do is to bring together to the thoughts of that universality and singular being. So here Hegel is incredibly critical of perception, and sort of saying that self-consciousness, which is just simply on the level of perception, is very certain of itself, but is just being sort of thrown about from one thing to another, one thing to another, one thing to another, without being able to bring everything together into a coherent whole. So perception can't organize all of these things, these differences which it's created, into some higher order network which can explain their relations to each other and all of their interactions. And that's what he means at the crucial moment at the end of this passage where he says that these untrue essences are trying to get the fact that it's, there's so many different things, are trying to get perception to bring together these thoughts into a universal and singular being. And this brings us to the level of the understanding. So the level of the understanding has two crucial levels, which we'll talk about in depth. And it takes local perception, which is being for self, and tries to get understanding of a universal principle which applies to all others. So being for all others, not just being for myself, but being for all others. And then a universal understanding as such, which is just being for the notion itself. And this is a crucial distinction. And it's probably one of the most important distinctions in Hegel, is this difference between being for others and being for notion. Because being for others is basically a universal understanding of the world, and being for notion is basically a universal understanding of notion in itself, which is an incredibly difficult concept to understand, and hopefully we can get some deeper understanding of it in this lecture. I guess at the moment I would say I'll use an example which I'll try to continue to keep consistent throughout the rest of the lecture, which is the notion of object as universal would be basically thinking about, say, space-time as a whole. Absolute space-time in a classical mechanics understanding. And then notion as such as universal would basically be understanding the notional mediation of absolute space-time within communities of human social dynamics, psychosocial dynamics. So it takes it to an internal level, from an outside to an inside, and the mediation of the notion as such. Quote, "It is essential to distinguish the two forms of understanding. For consciousness, in the first form, the object has returned into itself from its relation to an other, and has thus become notion in principle. But consciousness is not yet for itself the notion, and consequently does not recognize itself in that reflected object. In this movement for the first form of understanding, consciousness has for its content merely the objective essence and not consciousness as such, but the result must have an objective significance for consciousness, which appears in the second form of understanding. Consciousness still shrinks away from what has emerged and takes it as the essence in the objective sense, in the first form of understanding. With these forms, the understanding has indeed superseded its own truth, its untruth, and the untruth of the object, in sensation and perception, what has emerged for it as a result of the notion of the true. So this is a crucial passage, and it's important to sort of really understand here what Hegel's saying as we move through a deeper understanding of the understanding. The first thing is, again, I would stress this internal differentiation that Hegel's making between the understanding in its first form and the understanding in its second form. So the understanding in its first form is basically taking the world of perceived objects and integrating them into a total understanding. So again, you might say that the physics mind takes all the world of things and understands it in terms of space-time. All the things, all the possible perceived things are part of space and time somewhere. They have a location and a velocity moving around and positioned differently in space-time. Now, the second form of the understanding is basically the notion in itself. And the notion in itself is our internal self-consciousnesses, our ability to basically abstract a universal understanding. This is the life of the universal notion for itself. And it's through these mechanisms of understanding, both the external and the internal, I'll call them the external and the internal. And as you can see here, the motion from the first to the second form is from the outside to the inside, which is crucial. That Hegel believes that through these mechanisms of the understanding, we can overcome the limitations of sensation and perception, both because sensation is too fleeting and repetitive nows, and perception is too local, just me and this book, for example. Not all the world of things. So, again, on the first level, you have the universal meaning of being for others, and that is that what's true for me is true for you, what's true for you is true for another person, what's true for us here and now was true then. This is the level of the first level of the one is understanding, and this basic level of universality is part of the foundation of science, really, because if we want to get at objective truth, what that means is that we have an understanding of things which is true unconditionally for everyone. It's not true for me and not true for you. It's true for me and true for you and true for everyone else. So the example that would always be given is, of course, gravity or laws or the principles of evolution. They're true for all others. And that's for Hegel the first level of the understanding. But the second level of the understanding is basically being for notion, which is this ability of the universal notion itself to reflect back into itself. And that the movement of sublation is basically one as a plurality. So one as a plurality it's kind of flipping science upside down, and this is why Hegel is such a twist. Hegel is such a twist. Hegel, and as we'll get to in a future slide, Hegel is such an inversion of the normal way we're thinking, because with normal scientific thinking, we're used to thinking, we're conditioned to be thinking on the first level of what Hegel calls the understanding, but we're not used to thinking about this second level of the understanding. So again, the best example I could probably give is that, again, the physics community or the biology community, say, thinks in terms of a universal medium of being for others, that are presuppositions about space-time, for example, or our presuppositions about evolution are true for me, true for you, being for others. But we're not yet thinking about the universal understanding as reflected into itself. the way the subject comes to relate to its own universal understanding. And on this, I think we do have a way in which this reflection into itself, it's true for me and true for you, but it's still a difference. There's a universal truth for me and my universal understanding, and then there's a universal truth for you and your universal understanding. But this universal understanding, what we have to inscribe into it is a difference. And I think that this is what is at play as we'll continue to move through this chapter. Quote, because this unconditioned universal is an object for consciousness, there emerges in it the distinction of form and content. On one side, a universal medium a medium of many subsistent matters, and on the other side, a one reflected into itself, in which their independence is extinguished. The former is the dissolution of the thing's independence, the passivity that is a being for another, the latter is being for self. One moment then appears as the essence that has stepped to one side as a universal medium, but the independence of these matters is nothing else but this medium. In other words, the unconditioned universal is simply and solely the plurality of the diverse universals of this kind. This also means that they are absolutely porous are sublated. In other words, the matters posited as independent directly pass over into their unity, and their unity directly unfolds its diversity, and this once again reduces itself to unity. This movement is what is called force. So this is an incredibly difficult passage, but it's again an incredibly important passage. And again, I can only think about the fact that Hegel is really here flipping classical science on its head. Because what he's doing is he's taking this universal medium, which is true for all others, and he's saying that now we have to understand the way in which self-consciousness is historically enacting this. So we all agree about this outside, but what we're all agreeing about this outside is itself being mediated by a universal notion which is still moving. And so there's all these differences. So you have to take into consideration all of the subjects of science, which are all different from each other, and all mediating universality, which are all mediating the notion in itself. So it's historically engaged. It's historically phenomenologically engaged, and this is a head twister. It's a head twister. So then we get to the supersensible active sublation, and again, when we made that distinction of the understanding being for others as this outside and this understanding on the second level of this interiority, this being in itself, or this being for notion, he's saying that in history these notions as force are on the first level correlated to a force as substance and a force as interiority. So force as substance would be basically materialism. Basically materialism. So force as substance would be the force of materialism, which is based on which grounds the modern world. The modern world is basically founded on presuppositions of materialism, this external substance. But now he's saying with this second level, this force as interiority, which is basically we as subjects in history are affected by and are enacting consequences to the presuppositions of materialism. So then you have to think about force as interiority, and this is more and more important because science is going more and more from understanding this external outside to transforming this outside. So again, that's the force of interiority. And that for Hegel, he's saying that this is this developed force, this force on the higher level, which is basically the difference between, thinking this abstract outside, this material outside, and sort of being able with this knowledge to transform the world, the highest level of understanding. that this is the supersensible appearance of things in themselves. So he's basically saying that the inside of the highest level, the inside, the interiority of the force of our minds on the inside, and their interaction with the thing, with the outside, is the things in themselves. That's the things in themselves. The things in themselves is that motion. So if you take the greatest scientists alive right now, and the way they're mediating reality, that this is the supersensible appearance, the things in themselves. Quote, "The first universal would be force driven back into itself, or force as substance. The second, however, is the inner being of things qua inner, which is the same as the notion of force qua notion. This true essence of things has now the character of not being immediately for consciousness. On the contrary, consciousness has a mediated relation to the inner being, and as the understanding looks through this mediating play of forces into the true background of things. Within this inner truth as the absolute universal, which has been purged of the antithesis between the universal and the individual, and has become an object of the understanding, there now opens up above the sensuous world, which is the world of appearance, a supersensible world, which henceforth is the true world. Above the vanishing present world there opens up a permanent beyond." So this is again a complex but really interesting notion, and it's really about the interiority of our knowledge practices. It's really about the interiority of a well-developed understanding. That this interiority of a well-developed understanding is not perceptible. It's not sensation, it's not perception, it's supersensible. And this supersensible, so it's a supersensible understanding of space-time, a supersensible understanding of evolution, a supersensible understanding of any set of abstractions you like. It can be in art and music and philosophy itself and politics and, community life. It's this well-developed supersensible understanding which exerts a force in itself, and it's in itself the background of things. That's the background of things, is this horizon of well-developed understanding. And this horizon of this supersensible world, which is in some sense added to or subtracted from the perceptible world. So the supersensible is appearance qua appearance, the mediation of appearance. And yeah, we're getting super deep into the understanding, and the again you'll see the triadic structure here of the appearance qua appearance. I guess the appearance qua appearance, in terms of understanding it, is that you have the world of appearances, but through its mediation from it, you're working through it in sensation, you're working through it in perception. Now you're working on to the level of understanding, and it's this mediation of the appearances gains a qua appearances, which is that your supersensible vision of the appearances, which is a higher truth or more true. This is what he means when he structures this triad between first a pure empty void of consciousness, that consciousness fills it up with appearances, and it becomes the simple and true moving ground of force. Again, the well-developed force, the interior force. What that triad means is basically the well-developed understanding. There's an emptiness, which is just consciousness itself, that you'll then fill it up with appearances from your mediation of the appearances, and then you'll direct your consciousness towards this, and bring something new into being, basically. And that this mediation between these three stages is the supersensible inner world. And the supersensible inner world deploys itself as a stable image or a law. So there's the things in them, on a low level, the things in themselves, the outside world, which are constant changing appearances. But these constant changing appearances are being mediated by this supersensible understanding which has a law in itself for itself. So again, you give the example of physics. There's the appearances outside moving around, but we approach that world with our fixed understanding of a stable law, the laws of physics. Or you could say the laws of evolution, or any other future laws that we could come up with. And Hegel's understanding this as the stable image, so the image that doesn't change. So in the physics community, you have the stable image. The evolution community, you have the stable image, and that's how they do their work. That's how they mediate the appearances, and that's appearance qua appearance. So this is what he means by the understanding being this fixed patterns of integrated interaction. Quote, "The inner world or supersensible beyond has, however, come into being. It comes from the world of appearance, which has mediated it. The supersensible is therefore appearance qua appearance. The understanding, which is our object, finds itself in just this position, that the inner world has come into being for it, to begin with, only as the universal, still unfulfilled in itself. The play of force has merely this negative significance of being in itself nothing, and its only positive significance that of being the mediating agency, but outside of the understanding. The connection of the understanding with the inner world will fill itself out for the understanding. What is immediate for the understanding is the play of forces, but what is the true for it is the simple inner world. This inner supersensible world is an inert realm of laws which, though beyond the perceived world, for this exhibits law only through incessant change, is equally present in it and in its direct, tranquil image." So this is a really great passage, and again, the end is I think where I would want to direct the most attention. Beyond the fact that now he's talking about this supersensible world which has come into being, so it doesn't precede our development. Our development brings the supersensible into being. But then emphasizing that that this supersensible in itself has this quality of being a fixed level of patterns which presuppose an eternal constant. And this is what Hegel's calling the tranquil image. So equally present in it and is its direct tranquil image. And so you can see here that the supersensible understanding is basically here trying to get a hold on a truth, or trying to get a hold on a reality which doesn't change, which is eternal, and that Hegel's saying that this is the dialectical nature of the understanding as such, that when we move from sensation to perception to understanding, the understanding spontaneously wants this fixed image, this tranquil image, which will explain all the changing phenomena. So here, Hegel, even although he praises the understanding as the most powerful force, also notices a dialectical flaw in the understanding as such, which then leads to a new horizon for phenomenology, which is the positive dimension of the understanding is that it's capable of creating fixed patterns of integrated interaction. So it's capable of taking the sensations and the perceptions and creating an understanding which is true for me, true for you, true for everyone. But then he's saying that on at least the level before true self-consciousness is achieved, that the understanding cannot explain the field of becoming understanding. So we could say that when we're developing, we develop an understanding of the world for us, but we don't realize that the understanding for us of the world is not helping us to explain the movement of historical understanding as such. The movement of historical understanding as such requires phenomenology and requires phenomenologists. Quote, "This realm of laws is indeed the truth for the understanding, and that truth has its content in the law. At the same time, however, this realm is only the initial truth for the understanding, and does not fill out the world of appearance. In this the law is present, but is not the entire presence of appearance. With every change of circumstance, the law has a different actuality. This defect in the law must equally be made manifest in the law itself. What seems to be defective in it is that while it does contain difference, the difference is universal, indeterminate. But this plurality is itself rather a defect, for it contradicts the principle of the understanding for which, as consciousness of the simple inner world, the true is the implicitly universal unity. It must therefore let the many laws collapse into one law. The unification of all laws as universal attraction expresses no other content than just the mere notion of law itself." So what this is saying is that, again, at first here we're saying that this understanding of a universal law for yourself eventually has to undergo transformation, because there are always differences being discovered which will retroactively change what we think of as the law for all others. So when he says that with every change of circumstance the law has a different actuality, what he's saying is that when historical circumstances change, there will still be a universal law being for all others, but that it will have in itself it will have transformed. So a good example of this might be the difference between Newtonian science and relativistic science, or that, so maybe better would be Newtonian science, classical mechanics, and quantum mechanics. That in the transformation from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, what is being for others, what is the universal understanding, changes. And so that's what he means by the defect in the law must equally be made manifest in the law itself. So the fact that our universal laws, our universal understandings are not perfect has to be included. This difference, this possibility of everything being different has to be included into the law itself. So again, it's historical and phenomenological. So that's what he means when he says what seems to be defective in it is that while it does contain difference, the difference is universal, indeterminate. So again, on the first level of the understanding, you might have a law that contains all the differences, but it doesn't include this indeterminate difference, which is universal as well. This you could say, possibilities of otherness, this possibilities of total difference, this possibility that we could be totally wrong and that we could have totally different understanding of the world. So when we're thinking about the movement of the understanding in history and the notion in itself, we really have to question, again, this flipping upside down of the world, of the way in which the universal notion has to inscribe pure difference into itself. And this brings us to the level where where you move from understanding to self-consciousness, or what Hegel calls consciousness of consciousness. So on this level, we're really studying the motion of self-consciousnesses. And so we're no longer thinking about some basically scientific understanding of the outside. We're basically thinking about this inside, where each well-developed supersensible understanding has their own unity, but what's in between them are all these differences. So, you'll always have different paradigms which represent unity, which a certain subject will embody, but you'll always have differences between all of these different paradigms, and you'll always have the possibility that these unities could be totally other. And then you'll also, of course, have people, probably more in the postmodern universe, they'll embody difference as such. They'll just be difference as such, no longer unity. So this is on the higher level of self-consciousness, or studying consciousness of consciousness. The notion of law is turned against law itself. That is to say, in the law, the difference itself is grasped immediately and taken up into the universal, giving the moments whose relation is expressed by the law a subsistence. But these parts of the difference present in the law are at the same time themselves determinate sides. The pure notion of law as universal attraction must, to get its true meaning, be grasped as what is absolutely simple or unitary. The differences present in law as such themselves return again into the inner world as a simple unity. This is the inner necessity of the law. This necessity, which is merely verbal, is thus a recital of the moments constituting the cycle of the necessity. The moments are indeed distinguished, but at the same time, their difference is expressly said to be not a difference of the thing itself, and consequently is itself immediately cancelled again. This process is called explanation. So, basically, he's trying to describe this inversion. He's trying to describe this inversion where what notion takes as the law outside of itself has to be turned against itself. Because we're not all going to have a universal understanding of what's out there. And that this desire to have a universal understanding has to be mediated back into the inside. And this means we have to take the difference and internalize it. And that the universal notion in itself is just all of these differences combined. And that this is what's logically necessary. This logical necessity of including this difference, which is also often repressed or said not to be there when we give an explanation, when we give a universal explanation. When we give a universal explanation, we're always pretending this difference is the same difference we use to create a universal explanation is then sort of cancelled or obfuscated. Or not obfuscated, but he said cancelled, but negated. We pretend it isn't there. And this has to do with sort of basically what I would call a fundamental inversion of the thing in itself. So the fundamental inversion of the thing in itself is when you take an understanding of the notion for itself, which would be, say, just any schema of the outside which claims to be universal. Any schema of the outside which claims to be universal is the notion for itself. It's just the notion externalized. But then when you invert it and you take this externalized notion, you could take it as Newton's space-time, you could take it as Kant's noumenal, but now Hegel's trying to turn it inside, and he's saying that it's this interior force which is basically the notion for itself transformed into the notion in itself. And the notion in itself has to turn the law against itself. It has to take this unity, because it still wants unity, but this unity is all the differences. So it's basically the coincidence, it's flipping the coincidence of the opposites of difference and unity. What the unity outside wants to do is explain all the differences. And what the unity inside has to do is include all the differences. The first supersensible world, the tranquil kingdom of laws, the immediate copy of the perceived world, is charged into its opposite. This second supersensible world is in this way the inverted world. With this, the inner world is completed as appearance. For the first supersensible world was only the immediate raising of the perceived world into the universal element. It had its necessary counterpart in this perceived world, which still retained for itself the principle of change and alteration. The first kingdom of laws lacked that principle, but obtains it as an inverted world. This inverted world is the opposite of the first in the sense that it has the latter outside of it and repels that world from itself as an inverted actual world. That the one is appearance, but the other the in itself. That the one is the world as it is for an other, whereas the other the in itself. That the one is the world as it is for an other, whereas the other is the world as it is for itself. So, Again, the first supersensible world, it's again playing with this distinction between the first level of the understanding and the second level of the understanding, which is so crucial for this chapter and so crucial for Hegel's notion of the understanding, these two levels of the understanding. So again, the first is this supersensible world, which tranquil kingdom of law is just the world outside of explaining all the changes in our universal understanding. And he's saying that this is an immediate copy of the perceived world. So it's again what he says as reconciling the dialectical flaw in perception with the first level of the understanding. But the problem with the first level of understanding is that it doesn't explain the notion in and for itself. And that requires this second level of the understanding, which is this inverted world, which is the notion for itself. And the notion for itself basically repels the outer world. It wants nothing to do with the outer world. If you're going to try and if you're going to try and erase my difference with this universal world of laws, the tranquil kingdom of laws, I'm going to rebel against that because it's not universal notion for me. It's just the notion for itself out there, not in itself for me. And that's what the notion ultimately wants. So it's again a perspectival shift. And it's a perspectival shift which is in relation between difference and unity. So on the first level of the understanding, you basically have a totalization of the outside. So things interact in manner X. It's a first order understanding. But then on the second level of the understanding, you have a second order understanding, where you understand basically the historical phenomenal mediation of the outside, where you say, we understand things interacting in manner X. So you basically include the difference in the unity. That how we understand things interacting in manner X is always subject to change. And that it doesn't help us explain the understanding in itself and the notion in itself. Quote, from the idea of inversion, which constitutes the essential nature of one aspect of the supersensible world, we must eliminate the sensuous idea of fixing the differences in a different sustaining element. And this absolute notion of the difference must be represented and understood purely as inner difference, a repulsion of the self-same, as self-same from itself, and likeness of the unlike as unlike. We have to think pure change, or think antithesis within the antithesis itself, as contradiction. For in the difference, which is an inner difference, the opposite is not merely one of two. If it were, it would simply be without an opposite. But it is the opposite of an opposite, or the other is itself immediately present in it. Thus the supersensible world, which is the inverted world, has at the same time overarched the other world and has it within it. It is for itself the inverted world, the inversion of itself. It is itself and its opposite in one unity. Only thus is it a difference as inner difference, or difference in its own self, or difference as an infinity. So, in a long-winded way, what Hegel is basically saying is that we have to include the inner difference which characterizes the universal notion as such into our understanding of universality. And only when we're capable of conceiving this inner difference as universality will we be able to really grasp the infinity which appears in history. And of course, we still haven't been able to do this, and we still haven't been able to quite grasp this, because we're not at the end of history yet. We haven't been able to grasp the pure difference as universality. We haven't been able to grasp this pure difference that is the infinite notion which appears to every self-consciousness at its highest level. Every self-consciousness has this infinity within it, this pure difference within it, and has this capability to, as notion in itself, totally transform history as the concrete universality. And this brings us to the absolute. And this brings us to the difference between the first level of understanding as perfection and the second level of understanding as contradiction. Because we're not in a perfect, immutable world which is self-same, self-similar. We're in a world that's contradictory, becoming, it's evolving. And that's the absolute. That's the level of the absolute. So basically, on the highest level of the absolute, you have this internal contradiction between the outer world of appearances and the divided self-consciousness in the inner. And so the divided self-consciousness or the inner wants that identical eternity, and the outside is this difference and change, and the absolute notion is both of them at the same time. And realizing that each self-consciousness will have its own understanding. Or not its own experience of understanding, its own in itself of understanding, as pure difference, of infinite pure difference. And yeah, Hegel uses words at this part of the chapter, like essence of life, soul of the world, and universal blood. So what he's saying is that basically the infinite pure difference of the notion in itself is the essence of life, the soul of the world, the universal blood. It's the highest, it's the absolute. Quote, "We see that through infinity, law completes itself into an immanent necessity, and all the moments of the world of appearance are taken up into the inner world. That the simple character of law is infinity means that it is self-identical, but is also in itself different. Or it is the self-same which repels itself from itself, or sunders itself in two. This absolute notion, whose omnipresence is neither disturbed nor interrupted by any difference, but is itself every difference, as also their supersession, it pulsates within itself, but does not move, inwardly vibrates, yet it is at rest. Accordingly, we do not need to ask the question, how from this pure essence does this difference or otherness issue forth from it? For the division into two moments has already taken place. What was supposed to be the self-identical is thus already one of these two moments, instead of being the absolute essence. That the self-identical divides itself into two means, therefore, just as well as it supersedes itself as already divided, supersedes itself as otherness." So what this basically means is that we can't understand the absolute as this perfect, immutable unity. This perfect, immutable unity is already the divided subject. It's the division of the subject, and it's infinity. And it just needs to own this infinity. It needs to enact this in infinity, because the one is already divided within itself. That's why we're here. We wouldn't be here if the one wasn't divided in itself. So if the one was one, if the one was whole, yeah, we just wouldn't be here. So we have to assume that the one is already divided in order to appear to itself as one. And that we come to this through the supersensible understanding. And that in our supersensible understanding, that's the absolute notion in the inner world, our highest possible experience, which is for Hegel an eternal truth. So by going from sensation of the qualitative experience of just basic five senses, to perception, to distinguishing perceived objects, to integrating all of those perceived objects into an understanding, which is true for me, true for you, from understanding that each of us have this universal notion in our heads, which is developing in itself in history, we reach the highest level, which is the absolute, as pure difference. And as a one that must be divided in itself in order for all of us to appear. And that's the infinite thing. Easy? Quote, "We see that the inner world of appearance, the understanding in truth, comes to know nothing else but appearance as that play of forces in its absolutely universal moments and in their movement. In fact, the understanding experiences only itself. Raised above perception, consciousness exhibits itself closed in a unity with the supersensible world through the mediating term of appearance, through which it gazes into this background lying behind appearance. This curtain of appearance hanging before the inner world is therefore drawn away, and we have the inner being, the I, gazing into the inner world. Self-consciousness. It is manifest that behind the so-called curtain which is supposed to conceal the inner world, there is nothing to be seen unless we go behind it ourselves. The cognition of what consciousness knows in knowing itself requires a still more complex movement. So, again, what he's saying is that what we take to be the things in themselves, the absolute things in themselves behind appearances, is nothing but our own supersensible understanding in itself. That whenever we think that there's something behind appearances, this is already our supersensible appearances, and that is the thing in itself. So it's basically this coincidence between the absolute void and the absolute fullness. And that is basically, for Hegel, consciousness. And that is the end of the chapter on consciousness. So we went over, again, Hegel's understanding of sensation, Hegel's understanding of perception, Hegel's understanding of understanding, and then the dialectical mediation of the understanding itself. And before I leave, I would just like to thank all of my Patreon supporters, and if you appreciate these lectures and you want to help me continue making these lectures, the best way to do that is to become a Patreon supporter and get in touch with me if you have any questions, if you have any comments, or if you have any advice for how I can improve this channel. And thank you so much for watching, and I hope it was helpful. And if you look around my head, you'll see links to other lectures, you'll see a link to my Patreon page, and you'll see a subscription button. See you next time.